So let's see certain questions from the chapter Internal Audit and Standard SA 610. So let us get started. Here along with me, these are the quite often tested areas that we are going to see. Firstly, the question is about, can we use the work of internal auditor, and where we can use the work of the internal auditor, and when we cannot use the work of the internal auditor. So this is from SA 610. Using the work of internal auditor. While determining whether the work of internal auditor can be used for a specific purpose of audit, the external auditor, he should evaluate three things. So to check if the work of the internal auditor can be used by the external auditor, he should check about the DISCO. So this is how I have learned DISCO. That is, if the internal audit function applies systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. So firstly, internal audit function they are checking to see if there is a systematic and a disciplined approach. Then internal audit function, systematic disciplined approach. Next, level of competence. So internal audit function, then they are checking the level of competence of the internal audit function. Next, they are checking about the objectivity of the auditor. So internal audit function, then competence, then the objectivity of the auditor they are seeing. So let us go through it one more time. Whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach including the quality control. The level of competence of internal audit function and the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status and the relevant policies and procedures, they should support the objectivity of the internal audit. So one hand we have the internal audit function, the systematic and the disciplined approach. Then we have the competence of the internal audit function. So all these things they should support the objectivity of the internal auditor. So this is the first segment. So before we plan to use, we should check this. The second part is that when we cannot use the internal audit function, okay. So when we cannot use, when all these things are not there. So there is no systematic and disciplined approach, there is lack of sufficient competence, and the internal audit function, the policies and the procedure, they are not supporting the objectivity of the internal auditor. So in these cases, we cannot use the work of the internal auditor. Okay, so this is the first question that we are going to see in here. Next, question number 2. So what are the factors that should be taken into consideration when we want to use direct assistance of the internal auditor? So second we are telling, if we want to take the direct assistance, what and all we should check. Okay, fine, right. In determining the nature and extent of the work, so what and all work that we can do. So the first question what we saw is what we should evaluate. So before we are using the work, what we should evaluate. This question is the nature and the extent of the work. Okay. So for direct assistance. So firstly we should see how much judgment is involved. Okay. So amount of judgment involved. What two things? Planning and evaluating. Planning and performing the audit procedures and evaluating the audit evidence. So procedures and evidence. Planning the procedures, evaluating the evidence. PPEE. Planning the procedure, evaluating the evidence. So this is about the judgment. Then assess the risk of material misstatement and the external auditor's evaluation of existence and significance of threat to objectivity and level of competence. So next we are going to see about the risk of material misstatement. So first is about the judgment of PPE, planning the procedures, evaluating the evidence. Next is ROMA, risk of material misstatement. Then external auditors evaluation of existence and significance of threat to subjectivity and level of competence. So judgment is there, risk is there. So because of that, what is the threat to the objectivity? So much problem we have. So what is this competence of the internal auditor? So all these things the external auditor should check before going for the nature and determining the nature and the extent of the work. Alright, so moving on to the next question. moving on to the next question. So this question is talking about whether an external auditor can get a direct assistance from the internal auditor. So what and all we should see. Okay, so just what significant judgment related matters we should see. Alright, people, so this is just the discussion of the questions, quite often tested question. And the next area that we are going to talk about is, I'll read out the crux of the question. Can the statutory auditor can direct assistance from the internal auditor? Okay, so this is the way. So again, we're going to talk about the direct assistance point only. Clear? So in this question, what other point is there is that they are wanting to evaluate the significance of the test performed. Okay, we are wanting to evaluate the significance of the test performed. So when you want to evaluate if a significant sufficiency and significance of the test performed, so this is nothing but where you are exercising significant judgment is there. So a lot of judgment is involved to check if there is sufficient test is performed. So what and all is included in significant judgment? So significant judgment means what and all procedures you will tell. So risk of material misstatement. So analyzing the risk of material misstatement, it involves significant judgment. Sufficiency of test. So mistake risk is that for that test is enough or not. Evaluating the appropriateness of the management use of going concern assumption. Going concern assumption, that is a judgment is involved. Then significant accounting estimate. So there also judgment is involved. Evaluating the adequacy of disclosures. So there also significant judgment is involved. So whenever significant judgment is involved, you cannot get the direct assistance from the internal auditor. Super. So what are the points? Significant risk. So significant assessing the risk of material misstatement. So firstly we are talking about the risk. So for that risk we are going to do some test. Okay. So sufficiency of the test. So risk test is enough or not. Both are involving significant judgment. Then because of this, a going concern assumption, is the management use of going concern assumption correct? So all these are involving estimate. So estimate itself is a judgmental thing. Then adequacy of the disclosure. So all these are significant judgment matters. So in these areas we cannot get the direct assistance. Okay, and some more pointers with regard to that. So again, where and all we cannot get the significant where and all we cannot use the internal auditor's function. So again, let us check into that. Whenever it is involving significant judgment, you cannot use the work of the internal auditor. So that is what we saw in the previous example. So first is judgment. Next, the last question also, for second question also we saw, when there is about the risk of material misstatement. Okay, so if there is higher risk of material misstatement, so judgment, then higher assessed risk of material misstatement. Okay, then relate to work which the internal auditor have been involved. So first itself the internal auditor is involved. Again, if you want to take direct assistance from him, then it is like he doing his work two times. Okay, so relate to the work with which the internal auditor has been involved. Then relate to decision the external auditor makes. So external auditor only has to do. Relate to decision the external auditor makes in accordance with the standards on auditing regarding the internal audit function. Okay, fine. So in all these cases we cannot use the direct assistance of the internal auditor. We'll do it one more time. So significant judgment. Then next, relate to higher assessed risk of material misstatement. Then relate to the work which the internal auditor has been involved or he will be involved, and that he will report to the management or TCWG. Okay, then decision the external auditor only has to make with regard to the standards. Okay, so first judgment, risk of material misstatement, internal auditor, external auditor. That's all. Question over. Again, the next question is what and all significant judgment includes. So significant judgments means firstly about the risk, then test, then we are going to talk about the going concern, then about the estimates, and then about the disclosure. So in this cases, we cannot use the direct assistance of the internal auditor. Now moving on to the next question. Fine. So this question is talking about what and all is to be included in the audit documentation. Okay, if at all we are going to get the assistance of the internal auditor for the by the external auditor. So what should be documented? Let us know. So firstly, existence of the significant threat of objectivity. So point 1, what we need as an auditor: competence and objectivity. Who we need? So competence and objectivity. So we should check if there is any significant threat for them, otherwise we should not even go. So we should check about the competence and objectivity, and if it is there or there is any significant threat to the same. Next, extent, nature and extent of the work performed by the internal auditor. So first, how he is competent, how much he is objective, what is the threat for them. Moving on, next, what is the work that is done by him, so that we should document. Then work done, who is reviewing the work that was done by him, that is also be checked. What is the nature and the scope of the nature and extent of the work done by him. Then who is reviewing the work which is done by him, and what date and extent of the review is to be documented. Then agreement obtained from the authorized representative. So what we'll do, firstly, whenever we are going to use the internal auditor by the external auditor, we will also get an authorized representative that he will not be stopped by the management. So that agreement should be included in the documentation. Working paper prepared by the internal auditor should also be included. So firstly we will check who, which is the competence, objectivity, and that's existence and the significant threat to them. Next, nature and the extent of the work which is prepared by them. Then the work. Then who reviewed the work and to what extent the work was reviewed, we will see. Then the written agreement we will see from the authorized representative. Finally, we will see the work. We will document the working papers. So all these things we should see. In this case, what happens is that he is telling that the working paper should not be documented, right? But it cannot be excluded, because the standard requires that the working paper should also be documented. So that is the point in here. Alright. Moving on to the next question. One-liner question of this is: can the statutory auditor place a total reliance on the work performed by the internal auditor? So can he put entire emphasis and he believe him entirely? So don't believe anybody entirely anytime. Okay. The greater judgment needed to be exercised in planning and performing the audit procedures and evaluating the audit evidence. The external auditor will need to perform more procedures directly, because using the work of internal auditor alone will not provide the external auditor. So we cannot rely like that. So greater judgment is that. Then here the question is about the going concern. Okay. So that is also involving a significant judgment, because we already saw what and all is involving significant judgment. Risk of material misstatement, then testing, going concern, estimation, okay, then disclosures. So all these things are involving significant judgment. So because this is also involving a question about going concern, we cannot entirely believe them in total. Clear? Alright, so the next question is also about the inventory. So the inventory obsolescence is a place where we have a significant risk of material misstatement. So there is a lot of judgment involved. So we cannot place the reliance entirely directly on the internal auditor. Alright. Okay. Now, What are the activities that the auditor should perform before taking direct assistance? So, what we should do? Clear before you go for taking the direct assistance. So, if you see, the question can be answered in two different segments. So firstly, before the internal auditor is going to take a direct assistance, we should see certain things. Firstly, we should see about the coup, which is a competency and objectivity is there or not, we should see. Nextly, what we should see is that we should also get certain return agreement. Okay, return agreement we'll have to get. From whom we are going to get the return agreement? From the authorized representative we are going to get the return agreement. Okay, from the entity, so that they are permitting, because the internal auditor is an employee. Okay, so the in the authorized representative from the entity, they should permit the internal auditor to work for the external auditor. So the internal auditor should be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction, and that the entity will not intervene in the work of the internal auditor at the external auditor request. Also, the internal auditor also should give a written agreement that they will keep confidential of all the matters which are instructed by the external auditor, and they will also inform the external auditor if there is any threat to the objectivity. Clear? So all these things the external auditor should do with regard to communication with them. Before that, he should also check them. And above all these, what and all they should do? Fine. Here in the question, what happened is that the engagement partner, he had designed some substantive procedure. Alright. And now, on some selected assertion in response to the assessed risk of material misstatement. So there are some risk. For that, he has designed some substantive procedures. Such assertions were not tested by him in the previous year due to materiality or risk consideration. But now what he is doing is that he is incorporating an element of unpredictability in the audit procedure. So that is a good thing that he has to do. Right? He is incorporating the unpredictability, correct? But alongside that, what he is doing, he is also using the work of internal auditor to provide a direct assistance. So listen to the story. So firstly, this engagement partner is designing certain substantive procedure. Good. And because considering the risk, he is designing the substantive procedure. But in this area, he has not examined any risk due to in the last year. This year, he is incorporating some unpredictable element so that he can find fraud. But for that purpose, he is using the internal auditor. So using the internal auditor in this case to provide the direct assistance could prove to be counterproductive and defeat the purpose for which the substantive procedures were designed. Alright, so we already saw no significant judgment, risk of material misstatement, sufficiency of the test performed, then going concern assumption, estimates, what is the full point? Evaluating the significant accounting estimate, evaluating adequacy of the disclosures. So all these cases we should not use the work of the internal auditor. So this is about the chapter. Thank you. See you in the next video.